Ken Shuttleworth is with Make Architects in London, a founder of that practice. He left Norman Foster and Partners to set up his own practice in 2004, and thanks for coming to see us in London.
Thank you.
The first thing that comes to mind is right now you're putting up the tallest building, or the biggest building presently going up in London, 5 Broadgate. How is that project going, and just give us your thumbnail description.
It's not the tallest, but it's one of the largest floor plates ever built in London. It's for UBS, the bank, Swiss bank. The client's actually British Land. It's on the Broadgate site, so it's basically been a demolition of buildings built in the 1980s, and a new building on site at the moment. It gives very, very large floor plates for UBS is what they want, with offices on top. It's about 50 metres high. The differences between that and any other building in London, it doesn't have a lot of glass in it. It only has 35% glass. The rest of it is stainless steel and very solid and very highly insulated, and keeps the sun out and keeps the heat in. So from our point of view, it's very energy efficient, and for London, very energy efficient.
When I read about your past with Foster and Partners, I thought of the Millennium Tower project that was around back in the mid-late 1990s, and that was a 2,700 foot tall kind of conical shaped building.
Yeah.
And I think forward to today, when there is actually a 2,700 foot tall plus building out there, and I was curious, based on what you had seen before and what you're seeing now, how has the technology changed between the Burj Khalifa and what was being contemplated 15 years ago? I
think the difference is computers. I mean, there's a massive, massive difference in computer power now than there was back in the 80s and 90s. I mean, we can analyse everything. We make things much more efficient than we used to be able to do. And the interesting, that project was about prefabrication. It was about creating a factory, making the factory create components that then spilled out below it as it was jacked up the tower. So I think that the idea of prefabrication, I think, is something that would actually become much more relevant today. And there's the tower in China being looked at, built in 30 days, and a bigger one going to be built in potentially 90 days. So I think there's interesting spin-offs from that in terms of building things as a prefabricated way. But I think the biggest change is computers, and the amount of analysis that we can now do and fine-tune the structures, which used to be quite chunky, can now be much lighter.
There are a lot of opinions on prefabricated super tall buildings, and you kind of surprised me when you said that you thought that perhaps that might be the only way that some might get built. What is the advantage over prefabrication and modular versus the equivalent of stick build?
Well, the difference in that terms is actually building in a factory, is actually creating everything in a factory, prefabricating to the largest components possible. So you're not involved in the rain and the wind, and that sort of things. You actually just can build it in fully protected areas under proper managed conditions, and then bring it to site. Buildings have been built prefabricated for many years. The Hong Kong Bank down in Hong Kong, and lots of that was prefabricated. All the modules were done, all the toilets, all the plant rooms are all completely prefabricated and brought to site in boxes and stacked up, and then overclad. And I think that's still the way to go. I mean, it still means you can get a much more efficient time on site, and reduce the time on site, reduce all the many lifts, just to have big lifts, 1 or 2 big lifts per floor rather than 100 lifts per floor. So I think it's, we've always been looking at the cladding in that way. The cladding, most of the claddings we've done have been prefabricated in panelised systems, not stick systems. And I think the same should be for the stairs, for the toilets, for all the modules inside should be the same.
Are computers used mostly in your shop for design?
Well, computer's a tool, it's not a design tool. We still design on bits of paper and things, and bits of cardboard and models, but everything goes through the computer, absolutely. So everything comes coordinated through the computer, and it is a massively important tool in the office.
And the reason I ask is because if modular design, modular construction, I would imagine probably frees you in some ways as a designer. Does that create opportunities for design that you might not have otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, I think you get repetition. You can obviously get a much more efficient building out of it, but also you can actually spend more money on that particular component if it repeats many times. So from our point of view, if we can get repetition, it's much better for us, that we can actually put more loving care into that one element, which then gets repeated 100,000 times, and that's better than having every single one different. So towers at the moment, which I think the difference where we are now since 2008 is that towers are much more straight up and down, much more simple forms. Before we were all trying to outshape each other, we were all trying to come up with ideas and different shapes, and a lot of money and energy goes into those shapes. So it creates a lot of cost that you then have to take out of other things. Where a building is actually a pure building, allows you to spend a lot more money on the things you actually see rather than the geometry.
What interests you on the London scene right now?
London is a fantastic place to work. I mean, there's so much going on. Everything's by negotiation, so everything's sort of basically talked about and debated, and visualizations done. There's debates happening all the time. There's no prescription of what to do. It's actually every site is actually looked at on its own merits. So, as a place to work as an architect, it's really the best place to work as an architect.
Because there seems to be kind of a London style emerging from all these buildings that are going up. Is that a fair statement?
I think there's a contrast between the City of London and Canary Wharf. Canary Wharf's more, very much simpler buildings, much more about what the market wanted, much more straightforward. London's much more about working in historic settings. So you've got listed buildings to take into account, you've got views of St Paul's to take into account, you've got lots of other constraints you just don't have elsewhere. And those have led to some really interesting buildings, and very interesting shapes and forms. Like, Cheese Grater leans back to get the view from Fleet Street up to St Paul's, which you didn't have that on other projects, other parts of London. So I think it's, there's a style which has emerged based on, a lot of the buildings that you're seeing now coming out of the ground were designed pre-2008, so they're actually, pre-crash. So they're actually quite sophisticated forms, quite sort of strong forms, like the walkie-talkie like.
So we are designing the buildings now that are going to start appearing in probably 5 to 7 years in London.
And they're probably going to be simpler.
Simpler. I was going to say, what are those going to look like? How are those going to compare design-wise?
I think they'll be more sophisticated but simpler. I think they'll be much more akin to energy requirements and energy reduction of energy than the current crop. I think there'll be a big move towards less glass, keeping more insulation, keeping the sun out. In a way, sort of making sure that the buildings are actually more future-proofed. Because I think there's going to be a groundswell against buildings which actually guzzle gas, guzzle energy. I mean, much more towards energy-saving buildings.
And less glass. I was kind of surprised when you said number 5 Broadgate had less glass in it, because the open, letting in daylight seems to be a thing that a lot of people want.
Yep.
Why the reduction, and is that something we're going to see more of?
Yeah, I mean, I think putting the glass where it's needed is really important. So getting daylight into the building is very important. So we put glass at high level, but you don't need it at low level. You don't really need it behind a desk. That's where the heat gets in, you can't see out. So we've been looking at putting the windows where they're really needed on buildings and not just sort of everywhere. And I think there will be a big move towards that. I mean, averaging now 40% glazed, 60% solid, pretty much across the board. And as the regulations get tighter and tighter and tighter, unless you go to triple glazing or quadruple glazing, you're going to end up with small glass. And I think that's a challenge to the glass industry. If they can up the specs, make it more efficient, make it more energy conscious, that will mean we can have more glass. But at the moment, I think with the current technologies we've got, to actually get the carbon targets down, we have to look at smaller amounts of glazing, especially facing south.
What other kinds of technologies and changes in the next crop of London buildings?
I think there's going to be a lot more looking at different materials. I don't think you're going to end up with the same materials you've seen before. So if you don't have glass, what do you have? We've been looking at stainless steel, aluminium, different sorts of plastics have been looked at. Pull extrusions have been looked at rather than aluminium. I think that will be the most interesting thing, seeing what materials come out and how it actually affects the way the buildings look.
Is conservation, in that regard, is that something that solely can be done by changing the facade of the building? Are we still looking at energy creation, photovoltaics, wind turbines? Is that still part of the mix, or how has that shaken out in the last decade? I
think photovoltaics are still on the agenda. They still produce energy, but not really that much. Wind turbines, the problem with them in a sort of area like central London is what happens when they fall apart and spin off in all sorts of different directions. And anything that moves is going to break down at some point. So I don't think wind turbines are ever going to really catch on in central London, under current technology. They're great in fields, great in the middle of the North Sea. I can't see them in central London. But photovoltaics, solar thermal panels, absolutely. And I think it's, they just, at the moment, don't generate that much. What we can get is much more efficient plant nowadays. The cooling plant we can buy now is much more efficient than it was even 5 years ago. So we can get, combining with the cladding of the building being reduced the amount of energy coming through, we can also get much more efficient plant.
Now we have the ornamental buildings, the high-profile buildings in London, and someone brought up the fact that there needs to be kind of some background buildings there to fill in the spaces. Is that perhaps part of the next phase?
I don't think you need to. I don't think you actually need to think about having background buildings. I mean, every building should be its own building, should be there for its particular site, and work with the time and place in which it's being built. Whether that means they're simpler, I think that's not a case of just to have background buildings. That's because we need to think about things in a different way since 2008. But I think there'll be a crop of buildings coming next will probably be simpler, purer, more efficient.
Thanks for coming to see us, Ken Shuttleworth with Make Architects in London. Thanks.
Thank you very much.